Hey everyone, welcome back to Q's Book Reviews. My name's Quinn. I got inspired recently to do a book tag, and I was actually going to do the mid-year book tag, but I realized I couldn't answer many of the questions because I don't read a ton of series or books that were released recently. But if that's a tag you'd like to see me do regardless, just let me know. So instead I was looking for a tag that I thought I'd have some more interesting questions for, and I came across a few classics book tags. So the list that I have here is actually sort of an amalgamation of two of them because I like some questions and didn't like others. But with all that out of the way, let's get to the tag. So the first question is, why do you read classics and how often do you read classics? And answering this question will sort of let you know why I chose this tag in particular. I think classics are classics for a reason. They've stood the test of time, and while I don't think the writing's always going to appeal to everybody, there's usually a good chance that most people are going to like them. One of the things I most like about classics is that you can often find a lot of interesting analysis about them. People write about these books very often, and I always like being able to compare what I thought about a book to what someone else thought about a book. You can't always do that with modern books. Another thing is I like seeing the cultural influence they've had. With a lot of the classics, you can see the influence that they've had on other books that have come out after the fact, and I always really like being able to trace that lineage. Moving into the second part of the question, most of the books I read are actually classics. Some of them are newer than others, but I'm also always on the lookout for books that I think are later going to be considered classics. So I do sort of a mix of more contemporary stuff and the classics, but I do read a lot of them. The next question is, what is a period or country or culture that you haven't read many classics from, but you'd like to? And really the answer for me should be just about everywhere. I've mainly only stuck to like American and European classics at this point, but there's just so many other countries and cultures that I want to read from, so short answer, everywhere. Longer answer is that I'm most interested in reading more Asian classics. I recently came across the author Lu Xun, and I'm really interested in reading some of his works. If you guys know of any highly regarded Asian classics, doesn't really matter the region they're from, please let me know about them. Then we have, which modern book do I think is going to be a classic in 100 years' time? And I'm going to cheat and kind of give two answers here. The first is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy, and it might already really be considered a classic. It fits in line with a lot of the other 18th and 19th century American classics, and so it fit right in the canon as well. The only thing that I feel like might hold it back from being considered a classic is just the sheer amount of violence in this book. It's pretty staggering. But its story of America's westward expansion and its history of colonialism, along with the introduction of the character of the judge, who I don't think anyone wouldn't be scared of, really make it stand out. And then White Noise is more of my sleeper pick, but I don't think it's any less deserving of the designation. It has so many themes pertinent to modern society that older classics will really never be able to touch on, and it's a super fun read to boot. Being in the postmodern lineage, it perfectly dissects the culture we find ourselves living in, be that hyper-consumerism or our simultaneous fixation on death and also our extreme fear of it. This is definitely one I wouldn't be surprised if people continue reading for decades to come. The next question is, what is the last classic you read? And that's Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. I actually talked about this in my May-June wrap-up video, so if you're interested in my thoughts, I'll leave it up here. But overall, I really like this one, and I'm looking forward to reading more Virginia Woolf as well. For what was the first classic I read, it's definitely The Stranger by Albert Camus, and this is pretty much the book that got me into reading in general. It's really short, which doesn't hurt, and it's written in such simple language that it's almost the perfect introduction to classics, and in particular philosophical fiction. You can also really branch out into any direction after reading this, depending on what your interests are, and it's a great place to start with Camus. And if you're looking to learn more about Camus and his philosophy, I actually have a video going pretty in-depth, which I bet you'd enjoy, so again, I'll leave it up here. The next question is, what is your favorite classic book cover? And this is really a tough question just because so many of the classics have amazing covers, but I think I'm going to go with Crime and Punishment, this copy here. While it's not my favorite book, I just think this cover is really something special. Apparently it uses like vintage wallpaper for the design, and yeah, I love it. It's great. Then we have classic authors you wish had written more books. I'll start out with Emily Bronte, who only ever published Wuthering Heights, but this is just so good. I really feel like we're missing out by not having more works from her, so that's kind of sad. Also mention Oscar Wilde, who, while he has a lot of plays and poems as well, really only has a few like stories, The Picture of Dorian Gray being one of them, and again, it's so fantastic. I really wish we could read more from him. Finally, I want to give a shout out to Kafka, who wrote a few books, but some of them actually, like The Castle, were never actually finished in his lifetime. And so I think it would be interesting if we could see how he would have finished those books, or if he had written more books. I think they all would have been great. So those are my picks. Then we have probably the most contentious question on this list, which is what's your least favorite classic? And I'm probably going to go with Yevgeny Onegin by Alexander Pushkin, which is just a book I could never really get into and I feel kind of bad about. It's a lyrical novel about a Russian socialite who moves to the country and a sort of love affair that ensues, but nothing about it really stood out to me all that much. I think part of that's because I've never been a huge poetry reader, which is something I'm definitely trying to change, but it put me at a disadvantage already for enjoying it, which is too bad. The next question is my favorite translated classic, and I'm going to go back to one I already mentioned and say The Stranger by Camus again. This is translated from French, and it really holds up in English as well. I mean, I haven't read the original in French, which I really want to do someday, but I think the translator did a really great job with this, and yeah, the language is just great, so I would imagine it's also great in French. Then we have my favorite modern classic, which is published after 1900. And this is interesting because actually a lot of the classics I read are pretty modern, but I do think I probably consider a lot of books that aren't fully considered classic yet as classics, so that might skew it a little bit. But I'm going to go with Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. Having just finished Gravity's Rainbow, which is really just as good a book, if not even better, I think you really have to admire how much Pynchon was able to pack in just such a short book. The central story is so fun to follow and try to work out. The ending is borderline perfect, and the prose is incredible. So for me, this is definitely my favorite classic, and if not, just my favorite book in general. Then we have a question about classic literary places you'd like to visit. And honestly, I'd say there's nowhere I'd want to travel just for the literary context. But I'd probably say Paris just because it was really like a central literary hub for many centuries. So that'd probably be my choice. Then for my favorite classic that I'd recommend to everybody, well, I could go on and on about The Stranger and The Crying of Lot 49. I'm a bit hesitant to recommend them to just anybody because they're a bit weird and you do have to be in the right mood to fully enjoy them. So instead, I will go with The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. So it's a pretty easy to follow story, flowery but not super complex language, and a lot of memorable characters. So this really ticks off just about all the boxes someone might be looking for in a book. And again, there's so many other books you might want to read after reading this one that it's really a no-brainer recommendation. Then there's the question, what classic do you feel most embarrassed about not having read yet? And I'd say War and Peace and Anna Karenina, just because of how many other Russian classics I've read at this point. I would have expected to have read some Tolstoy, but the truth is I haven't. I do really want to get to these at some point, but I've never really made time for them, so that's something I need to change soon. Especially given how many people swear by these books or consider it their favorite. I really am looking forward to reading them. To go along with that, the next question is the top 5 classics you want to read soon. And so for the first one, I'm going to choose War and Peace. The next is 100 Years of Solitude, which I'm really hoping to start soon just because I've heard it's such a fantastic book. I'll also go with Ulysses by James Joyce, which I'm still definitely intimidated by, but I feel a little more comfortable trying to approach it. So again, hopefully I get to it soon. Then I really want to read more Jane Austen as well. I've only read Sense and Sensibility so far, but I recently picked up Mansfield Park. But the one I really want to get to is Pride and Prejudice, so we'll see when I get that. Finally, I'll go with The Sound and the Fury by William Faulkner. I just recently finished As I Lay Dying, and it's definitely one of my favorite books of the year so far, so I have no reason to believe I won't love this one just as much. For my favorite movie version or TV series of a classic, I'm going to kind of cheat again. I'm going to choose 2. For the first one, I'm going to choose Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck. I actually haven't read the original books, that's why it kind of feels like cheating. But the movie is pretty good. It's a bit old, but it definitely stands up today. I'm also going to go with No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, which is another one I haven't actually read yet. But it's written like a screenplay, which is kind of interesting, and it's adapted perfectly to the movie. So if you haven't watched it yet, go do yourself a favor. The next question is favorite editions you'd like to collect more classics from. And while I do really like the vintage international copies of Camus' books, something about the white and black really just does it for me. There's 2 more that I'd say I'm a little more partial to. One is the Penguin English Library editions, which I only have 2 of right now, but I love the covers and the spines are really nice. I think having a whole bunch of these would just look really great together, so definitely want to get more of these. They're also really quite cheap, and even though I did get both of these secondhand, they're only $12 Canadian new, which is kind of a steal. The other editions I really want to get more of, though this is kind of a treat. I don't think I'm going to get too many more of these just because they are kind of on the expensive side, but that's the cloth-bound classics. Really, I mean, these are great copies. The only thing is they're not super great to read from, although they do look beautiful, as sometimes the sort of like stuff on the front tends to wear off. This is my copy of Moby Dick, which is really quite beat up, so I don't know, kind of a collector's edition. I might reserve it for books that I really come to love and want a special version of. The last question I have here is an underhyped classic that you'd recommend to everyone. And I'd say for this, probably Kafka. I don't think he gets enough love in general. He's got wonderful short stories such as The Metamorphosis and In the Penal Colony, and his longer works such as The Trial or The Castle are really just as good. He perfectly encapsulates the sort of bureaucratic nightmares we often find ourselves in, and his brief moments of surrealism really just hit hard. So if you haven't yet ventured into Kafka's works, I'd really recommend it. So that's all the questions I had. Instead of tagging anyone else, I'd love it if you guys would actually just answer these questions yourselves in the comments. It'd be really great to get to know you all better. Hope you enjoyed watching this book tag, and if there's any others you'd like to see me do, let me know. If you want to see more from me, make sure to subscribe, and other than that, take it easy.